Thank you for the host committee for turning out tonight. Quick introductions. I think you all know these two. Dixon Osburn is the author of Mission Possible, the story of repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Dixon was co-founder and executive director of Service Members Legal Defense Network that led the successful effort to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Gary Espinas is a retired U.S. Army colonel who was investigated under Don't Ask, Don't Tell in 2003. He currently works in the Department of Defense and serves as an adjunct instructor at the United States Naval Academy and George Washington University. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over for these two. Enjoy your evening. Yeah, you can take off.
Good evening and welcome to our discussion with Dixon. As David mentioned, Dixon wrote this fantastic book in front of us, the story of Mission Possible, the story of repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Dixon was also the co-founder and executive director of the Service Members Legal Defense Network, or SLDN, with whom I myself had a history that I'll talk about very shortly. My name is Gary Espinas, and with thanks to David Mariner for inviting me to do this, I have the pleasure of facilitating our discussion this evening. I encourage you to ask questions throughout the program. We're looking forward to having a dynamic and an interesting discussion with Dixon this evening. Also, if any of you are veterans who served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we would invite you to also share your story with us this evening. As for my own story, I served in the U.S. Army for 26 years, retiring in 2013 as a colonel. In 2003, however, I was investigated under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. At the time, I was assigned to the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, Russia, where I was a political military officer responsible for covering the strategic arms control portfolio between the U.S. and the Russian Federation. One day, a day that I will certainly never forget, the embassy security officer approached me and asked me point blank, "Are you gay?" Realizing the predicament that he had put me in, I decided that I would answer truthfully. I was not going to lie. My admission to being gay, however, was obviously a violation of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And as a consequence, I was immediately sent home from Moscow and placed under investigation by the Army for homosexuality. Before I left Moscow, the U.S. Defense Attaché, an Army Brigadier General who initiated the investigation against me, advised me to start making different plans because in his words, my career was over. When I returned to the States, one of the first calls I made was to SLDN, and I spoke with Kathy Westcott, one of the attorneys on staff. Facing separation from the Army, particularly at this point in my career, I had 16 years of service under my belt at this point, was a frightening experience indeed. But having SLDN in my corner helped me through the ordeal. Thank you, Kathy. For reasons that were not explained to me, however, the Army ultimately did not kick me out, and I was able to continue my service. Certainly, I recognize how truly lucky I was when, under the Damocles sword of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, almost 14,000 men and women were discharged from service simply for being who they are, and countless others were forced to serve in silence. As Dixon famously said about Don't Ask, Don't Tell in April of 2000, when you have a federal law that treats you as a second-class citizen, it gives others permission to treat you in that way. In Mission Possible, Dixon tells the story of how Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, a fight in which he played a leading role. As his friend, Navy Captain Mike Rankin, said about Dixon, it took special courage for a civilian to come to the defense of his military brothers and sisters. That is what Dixon strived to live up to every day. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct privilege and honor to introduce you to Mr. Dixon Osburn.
Thank you, everyone, for coming out on a blustery evening, the week of the Sea Witch Festival. It reminds me, one of the stories that's not in this book is that in our earliest days in 1993, when we were trying to raise money, we created a gala called In the Witch Hunts, which took place right around Halloween every year. We had service members who held up pumpkins that were auctioned off, and I did cause a bit of a disruption sending a card with the Wicked Witch of the East and San Nun and Ass separated at birth that ended up in some congressional offices. But thank you for being here this evening. Thank you, David, for hosting us tonight. Lives intersect in so many ways, and Dave and I have known each other, or of each other at least since 1993, because his sister Rachel was one of the lawyers who worked with us when she was a lawyer at Skadden Arps. So tonight, I do encourage you to reflect on the evening. If you tweet some suggestions or to use words like epic, and Gary asked this question, he won't believe what happened next. Little ways to spur the interest in this. But I wanted to pick up and just first start off and provide, what was Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and Gary described it well, which it was this sort of Damocles sword. Let me just give you a few stories. We'll go into more stories during the evening. But some of our clients at Service Members Legal Defense Network, Corporal Kevin Blakely, he went to a psychiatrist and wanted to know what it meant to be gay. He was questioning his identity, but he hadn't come to any conclusions. But just thinking about being gay was enough for her to turn him in to his commander, and for the commander then to discharge him. West Point cadet Nikki Galvin, her commander asked her point blank, "Are you a lesbian and are you sleeping with this other cadet?" And she said, "Sir, you're not allowed to ask me." And based on advice from professors at West Point, she turned him in for sexual harassment. He then turned the investigation on her, took her diary. It's a diary that grief counselors told her to keep because she just lost her mother. And in the diary, she confided to being a lesbian. And that was the basis for her disenrollment from West Point. There's the story of Timothy McVeigh, not the Oklahoma City bomber, but he was a Navy submariner. He was the chief of boat, which is one of the most prestigious positions that you can hold. And he was helping out with a toy drive one Christmas. And he sent the commander's wife a message asking about the toy drive, but he ended up using his AOL account. And so she, being curious, looked up his profile, which under marriage said gay. And then they went after him for that. So we have legions of stories where, Gary was able to survive. There were so many who did not under this policy. They kicked out 14,000 people under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There were 114,000 that were kicked out since World War II. So what was Don't Ask, Don't Tell? It was a law that was a ban, much like many of the bans that existed since World War II. You could be kicked out for saying that you're lesbian, gay, or bisexual to anyone, anywhere, anytime, psychiatrist, mom, dad, clergy. You risk discharge. Acts, which is sex, but was also anything that a reasonable person thought might be homosexual. So if you did this to a buddy, if you hugged somebody who you're consoling someone, you could be discharged because that reasonable person assumed that meant you were gay. And marriage, which to me was amazing, because marriage didn't exist in 1993. In fact, the band's prior banned marriage as well. They knew what we were after, and so they wrote it into the law even back then. President Bill Clinton sold the policy as a step forward, as an honorable compromise. And I actually think he believed that, because in the regulations that implemented Don't Ask, Don't Tell, there were some promises that said you could come to an event like this. You could read letters from Camp Rehoboth. You could go to a gay film festival, march in a gay pride parade. Those weren't, you could go to a gay bar, and those weren't supposed to be a basis for discharge. But what they didn't tell people is that the footnote to those regulations was, well, if we still go after you, it creates no substantive or procedural rights. So it just eviscerated any of the promises. And this is what Michelle Beneke, my co-founder, and I inherited in 1993 when we started Service Members Legal Defense Network. We inherited something that used to be a regulation that Congress then codified as a statute, which made it very hard to get rid of. And we inherited a law where there's a bipartisan majority in Congress, a Democratic president, and the Pentagon all in agreement that the ban was the considered policy to regulate lesbian, gay, bisexual people in the armed forces. We inherited a statute where the majority of the public opposed gays serving openly in 1993. 90% of service members said that they were uncomfortable with gays serving openly in the military. So it was in this crucible that we jumped. Probably not the smartest time to start an organization, but Michelle and I believed that, in the wake of this wrenching debate in 1993, that the foot was in the door and you needed to lean in and push hard. And so we set about crafting a strategy that ultimately led to the repeal. And I look forward, this book, Mission Possible, is that story. It's the story of how did we go from, this horrible, draconian, Damocles sword type law to final repeal of that law in 2011.
Well, thank you, Dixon, for those remarks. I think you sparked a lot of interest, and I'm sure there are many questions here. So we would like at this point to invite you to ask your questions. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, if you served in the armed forces during Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we would love to hear your stories and your reflections on your own experience. So the floor is open to all of you. Okay, you, and then Andy?
Yeah, so I'm not a vet at all, but if I remember correctly, in 1993, when President Clinton came in, he tried to allow the people to serve in the military. And the Secretary of Defense, I think was the Joint Chief of Staff was
Powell. Yeah.
and he played a role in what ended up to be Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And Powell, of course, this is what I wonder if you have any comments about the role.
So General Powell was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time in 1993, and he adamantly opposed allowing gays to serve openly in the military. He famously stood on the steps of the Pentagon, citing the number of phone calls that were coming in of people opposing it. And there were a number of veterans groups that were directing massive numbers of calls into the Pentagon and to congressional offices that the LGBT community just didn't match in any way. And he testified before the Senate that he thought that unlike race, which was a benign characteristic, being gay was not. And that is what he said. I think that he did a huge disfavor to the commander-in-chief by not understanding the commander-in-chief's strategic intent. And there's a huge contrast with Admiral Mike Mullen, who understood President Obama's strategic intent early on and aligned himself to ensure that they could move forward with it. That being said, I knew, and Michelle knew back in 1993, that we either had to get General Powell to change his mind or we had to neutralize his opposition. And one of the things that I talk about in this book that I had not talked about before is I actually met with him and I talked with him and I sent him information and I sent him data. And there was this moment in 2007, General Saakashvili, who succeeded him, who's also retired now, but he did an op-ed in the New York Times saying, it's time to reconsider Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And he called, I had sent him the op-ed. He called me and said, Dixon, I agree. And I literally was like, my head hit the table. I was like, here, we have the moment. Then came the but. And he says, but I'm not convinced yet that the senior leadership is ready for this. On that call, I put it on the line. I said, sir, you realize I need you to support this when the time comes. He said, I know. So in 2010, 3 days after Admiral Mike Mullen testified in the Senate, saying that it was time to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, General Powell issued a statement and said, if Admiral Mike Mullen and the leadership believe it's time to repeal it, I do too. And that was huge. That was huge. So you got alignment then, and you created this space that didn't exist in 1993, but you got a space where senior leaders could now come forward and call for repeal. So I actually did a column on General Powell's passing and noted my criticism of his decision in 1993 and some redemption in 2010.
One of the things that struck me in reading your book, Dixon, is I really felt that I was in the room as you were having these conversations with General Powell and Admiral Mullen and all of the other key players behind the story. I was just completely intrigued from page 1 to page 460. Andy, I think you had a question?
I mean, why now? What inspired you to deliver this story? Time in your hands, but there must be a reason that you said now is the time to document this story and process you usually push it. If you could just recap the question
So the question is why now? Why did I publish this book in 2021? And the short answer is that we are now at the 10th anniversary of repeal. So repeal took place September of 2011. And there were several reasons why I wanted to tell the story. And I can tell you, pandemics are a great time to sit down and write. Have to talk to people, you just type away. But there's several reasons why I wanted to. One, I really did want there to be a historical accounting of how Don't Ask, Don't Tell repeal took place. Imagine that the young man or woman, 18 years old, that are entering the armed forces today, for 10 years there's been no discrimination. They couldn't be kicked out for being gay. So they don't even have any sense of what the stories of those who were impacted by this policy were. It's not taught in high school. It's not taught in military courses, though I'd like to see it, part of the teaching. I did it because I wanted, I hope that this book is a compelling case study of how social justice can happen. We have big, gnarly, tough issues that we're facing every day, and sometimes the odds feel insurmountable. And certainly you can name the issue du jour, and there are a lot of issues du jour, but the point of the book is, even though Michelle and I tackled this at probably the lowest point, at its nadir, there was still a way to see, the end where we could get to repeal. So I wanted to provide, a case study that I hope people can draw lessons from and apply to their situation as well.
My sense is your book has several audiences. It's a great case study, not only for this specific action, but in terms of leading change, making change happen, more broadly. It's a book about leadership to each individual service member who exhibited true courage. It's a story about, policy and how policy works, inside the Beltway. But most of all, it's a story about resilience and spirit and not giving up. Any other questions? Fran, please.
The question is, I'm going to give you a little story to go with. The question is, and I'll tell you why in a second. The question is, did you find civilians in the military taking career different books and more open to business? And I'll tell you why I say this. I came out of graduate school, went to work for Bell Labs, got a top secret security clearance, no problem. I really became with enough. So fast forward 5 years later, become very friendly with all the civilians on this project. They come to our house, we were living together, the security office was there, and then my security clearance was up for renewal. The whole process again, and as you know, on the civilian side, they go through all the categories, you know, your finances, and then they get to the moral behavior section where they would normally ask you, are you gay? And they clearly knew, because the security officer knew they'd been to our neighborhood, talking to our neighbors, and the officer just said, define good moral behavior for me. And he just left it at that and never said, oh. So my question is to see the difference between the actual military and civilians in the
So the question is whether or not civilians in the military were more open or more helpful to the cause of repealing Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And let me give you, a good example. So in 1995, the Pentagon had a policy of recoupment, which meant they would go after the military scholarships of service members, whether they were in ROTC or gone to graduate school. They would demand that they repay them if they came out as gay. And under the Bush administration, under Dick Cheney as the head of the Pentagon, they had done away with that policy. But as soon as they left, they put it back in. And so we went back into the Pentagon. John Deutsch was the Deputy Secretary of Defense. And he actually was very sympathetic. He had been in IT where a couple of his ROT students were being recouped against. That's how Cheney decided that that was a bad policy. So that's an example of where civilians are very supportive. And we had these fairly difficult cases. One of them, Clay Slaughter, he wasn't even kicked out under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. He'd been kicked out like 10 years before, and he never paid back the money for his ROTC scholarship. And so the Pentagon finance people send him the bill for the scholarship plus interest. And so now he owed like $700,000. I said, well, you want check, credit card? How are we going to do this? So Deutsch tasked a civilian, a pretty fresh graduate of Dartmouth College, to help us try to figure out how to get these decisions stopped. And that person was Eric Fanning. Those who don't know who Eric Fanning is, he would ultimately become Secretary of the Army under Obama. Openly gay, the first openly gay Army Secretary. So it's always interesting how lives intersect, and what will happen in one moment will happen in another. So that's an example where civilians really were trying to do the right thing. There were other civilians who also just didn't get it, meaning, give you an example, Michelle Beneke and I made the claim that people could go to jail just for coming out. And I'll tell you why in a minute. But the General Counsel of the Pentagon, Jamie Gorelick, who then became Deputy Attorney General next to Janet Reno, said, that's preposterous, calling us out on C-SPAN. Well, sure enough, we had clients where commanders would say, no, I'm asking you if you're a lesbian. And if you don't tell me the truth, and I find out the truth, I'm going to charge you with perjury or making a false official statement. And he then went after her colleagues and said, if you do not tell me if she's a lesbian, I'm going to make you an accessory to this as well. And so they created this entire criminal structure. Michelle and I could see this very clearly, that this was a problem, and they need to be really clear with some command guidance at the outset when implementing Don't Ask, Don't Tell, to try to make those guidelines mean something. But she just did not have an imagination of just how bad it could be. And so one of the strengths of our work at SLDN, one of my legal directors said, you know why commanders hate us so much when we call them? It's like, why? It's because they know we're right, and they know we have documentation. And that's how we try to live our lives through SLDN, is to always be very certain about what we're trying to say and what we're trying to do.
You mentioned,
question back here.
Yeah, let me
I'm just thinking part of a comment. I'm retired Air Force, served prior, during, and also was serving during the repeal. That basically thanks to your work, you know, what you did, repeal day was the biggest non-event in military history.
So the comment was, don't ask, don't tell repeal day, September 20th, 2011 was the biggest non-event. And a colleague of mine, I heard this story multiple times, was so nervous showing up to work that day. He had a job in the Pentagon, and he sat down on his desk, and he said, I just stared at the phone because I thought I'd be ringing off the hook. It was just any other day. There were, the critics said that there would be mass resignations of officers, that the sky would fall, and none of that happened. And in the 10 years since repeal, there have been no significant issues, which doesn't mean that there isn't homophobia, that there isn't harassment, that's happening. But I know from service member after service member that I talked to today, they will go to their commander and come out to them, and they say, if anybody gives you any trouble, come to me first. And that's leadership. That's exactly what should be happening to deal with any issues that come up. But while it's a non-event in some ways, it was also a massive event, because for the lesbian, gay, bisexual service member, it meant you could show up to work and be authentic. No, everybody had to choose in their own time when and how they would do that, but they didn't have this Uncle Sam peering over their shoulder, ready to discriminate against them because of the law.
I'm a 30-year retired Army colonel. My job was psychiatric nursing, and I dealt with a lot of people. I didn't personally I had some issues, but not very much. But I dealt with a lot of people who were under stress from different areas. What could you say about service-connected disability from the witch hunt? I mean, there was a lot of damage done mental health-wise to many, many people lifelong. And is that what's happening today that is all connected to the past?
So the question is, what can you say about service-connected disability for those who've been discharged under don't ask, don't tell? And in fact, that is, when people ask me what is left on the table, that is one of the issues, is that I know so many who have served, not just under don't ask, don't tell, but prior policies, that are really suffering some post-traumatic stress disorder because of, people don't get, unless you're in that position, to think that the full weight of the government is coming down on you, and that every single day you are changing the pronouns of your friends and of your partner, and trying to avoid being seen, in the grocery store with somebody. You're constantly having to censor yourself. And I don't think the VA has come to the full realization yet that there is a significant question around PTSD. What has happened is, and you saw this on the 10th anniversary of repeal, is that the VA at least has acknowledged that those who were less than fully honorably discharged under don't ask, don't tell or prior policies, that needs to be changed so that veterans can receive their full benefits that they're entitled to.
Sure. What about the rank and file today? Do we have any sense of what the level, has the Pentagon done any studies to know what the level of acceptance is? I ask that in the broader context of the Trump years and what we've seen in broader society today, where I think a lot of other people feel that when it comes to equality in a number of areas, we've seen racism and a whole lot more hate rear its ugly head in ways that we didn't think existed. So I'm curious, in the context of the military today, whether you have any sense of where things are with rank and file.
So the question is, in the context of today, are there studies that have been done on the attitudes of those currently serving toward lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender people? And I don't know of any studies. I know one that was done 1 year after, where Aaron Belkin at a group called the Palm Center worked together with academics of each of the academies to do a study, and their findings were as a non-issue. But I think your point is valid that 2012 is different than 2021 after 4 years of sort of constant hate mongering that we saw. one indication might be that even with the issue for transgender service members where Trump retweeted a ban, there was actually pretty significant resistance by General Mattis and others. They did not want to move forward with that, but they also felt like they could not disobey the order of the commander-in-chief on it. So they dragged it out for a good amount of time, but ultimately reinstated the ban. And you've seen under President Biden, one of his first actions was to remove that, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was highly praising of all of our troops to try to reset that tone. But to your point, I actually don't know a study to see if any of those attitudes have changed.
There was a question in the back.
You mentioned that the creative consider benefits to people who are so is there any procedure in place for people to repeal their second discharge? Does that have to be reversed and changed to the article or whatever would be working?
That's a good question, and I don't have an exact answer. I know that Mark Takano, this one from California, who's the chair of the Veterans Committee in the House, is sort of actively looking at how they can speed up that process. Now, it is the case that if you need your discharge upgraded, that you can have an attorney. The successor group to Service Members Legal Defense Network, the Modern Military Association of America, would, I think, be very happy to assist in connecting people with lawyers that could help them get that process done. In the past, it's taken a long time. I think they're trying to get it so it'll be a lot more automatic.
Your earlier comments a little bit sensitive towards that. Can you speak a little bit more about why you felt like this was right? On how the position changed.
So President Clinton, when he was running to become president, he had reached out to David Mixter, who was sort of one of the godfathers of the LGBT movement, and asked him, what can I do as a new president to help the gay community? And to give it some context, recognize that this actually was a big deal. People were not soliciting our support and what they needed to do to try to advance LGBT equality, and Clinton was one of the first that sort of saw us as part of the overall family. And a number of ideas were presented, but the one that resonated with him was doing an executive order to remove the ban on gays in the military, because it's something that he, as commander-in-chief, could do. But what he did not recognize, and I think he was really quite naive arriving in Washington, he didn't realize what kind of political firestorm that would set off. Because immediately you had Sam Nunn, who opposed him, you had Bob Dole, who opposed him, and General Powell, who opposed him. And it was over before it even started. And the only way he could have done anything differently would have been to ask for General Powell's resignation and have a new chairman of the Joint Chiefs who supported repeal. Or he could have leaned in hard and said, I'm doing this, and issued the executive order immediately. And he didn't do that. And I think it's not clear whether that would have survived, because I do think that you would have had members of Congress suing to get it reinstated, or they would have gone forward and just put it into law. So I think President Clinton, if you sort of watched him through his presidency, he first was trying to defend the policy, because I think he really did believe that it was a step forward, even though Michelle and I were out there proving day after day, story after story, that it wasn't. Then there was a point midway through his presidency where he finally said, well, I'm having some qualms about this policy. And then by the time I left, and I had actually reached out to him through folks, I got him to completely repudiate the fact that he supported it. And I thought that that was incredibly important. Part of what Gary was talking about is how this, is a sort of study in social change and how do you do it. And one of the many different avenues that I pursued is I wanted Clinton to repudiate it, which he did. I was able to reach out and get Jimmy Carter to support repeal. He was the one who put in the ban prior to Don't Ask, Don't Tell. I got him to be supportive, and then I got every single Democratic candidate who's running for office to be supportive. And one example of that was General Wesley Clark, who was considering running. I went to one of his meet and greets, and he pulled me out of the line, and we talked. And I then went to the DNC and said, we cannot have a general running for the nomination who then pulls us back. He needs to be supported. So whatever set of circumstances, the stars aligned, and he then was asked to meet the press, and he said he fully supported repeal and gay serving openly. So Bill Clinton, I ultimately came to the conclusion that it was the wrong policy. I don't think he fully gets how the machinations that happened in 1993 were in part of his own legacy and what he did wrong. But he did support gay serving openly at the beginning and at the end.
Is there another question in the back here before I move here? No? Sure.
Can you disentangle the policy from how it was implemented? So was it the policy that was the problem, or was it the way that it was implemented or enacted day to day? So for instance, Gary was asked, or don't ask, don't tell, should have been asked. So
the question is, can you disentangle the policy from how it was implemented? The law itself, and it comes into, we'll do three parts. The law itself was really draconian, the one, the statute passed by Congress. The only exception to the ban on gays in the military was you were not supposed to be asked, by a recruiter, are you gay? That question came off of the forms. It actually didn't. We kept getting them even into the 2000s, saying you still haven't replaced your form. They're saying, we're just trying to use up the paper. So that's part of the implementation of it. I talked about the regulations that were supposed to be a little bit better, but then the footnote was, but it creates no rights for you if you want to complain. So, just because you got caught up in a witch hunt, they'd say, well, we're sorry, you're right, that shouldn't have happened, but there's nothing we could do, and these folks have been discharged now. So the part of what we, in our strategy at the beginning, from 1993 through 2000, was we really talked about the implementation because we wanted people to understand just how bad this was. The harassment people were facing, the circumstances under which people were being kicked out. And then we could pivot to the next argument, which was, no, it's the law that's wrong. Because back in 1993, remember at the beginning I said how the public supported this, the military supported this, the Congress supported this. There's no way you could say this is wrong and have anybody actually listen to you. We had to create a fact base to demonstrate that this was a really awful law. And it wasn't just implementation, it was the law itself. There was no middle ground here. It's the law that had to go away. So by 2000, I actually started seeing an opportunity where we could pivot back into Congress and start building out the sort of bipartisan congressional support that we would need for ultimate repeal.
Dixon, you mentioned earlier Eric Fanning, whom many of us know and in fact are friends with. Indeed, there are several people throughout the book that many of us know and are friends with. I would call out Army Major General Tammy Smith, Army Nurse Colonel Margaret Kammermeyer, Air Force F-15 pilot Victor Fehrenbach, and many, many others. Another person whom you mentioned in your book played a very, very important role as one of the first general officers to come out publicly, which you talk about in the chapter entitled Poppycock. And unfortunately, Army Brigadier General Keith Kerr died yesterday. And I'm wondering if you might share something about General Kerr in the book.
Sure. He was a wonderful individual. I met him first in 1995 in San Francisco, the year after he had retired from the California military reserves. And before the California military reserves, he had served 30 years in the Army, active duty and reserves. And he really was sort of that combination of soldier scholar. In his second life, he was a professor as well. And I remember I met him at a cocktail party and said, "Sir, I really want to sit down and talk with you." In 1995, I was there with Zoe Dunning, who's another one of the heroes of the repeal effort. And I said, "Sir, I'm going to lay all my cards on the table. I'm going to ask you to join our Military Advisory Council, and I'm going to ask you to come out." He looked at me. He thought it's like I was from Mars. It's like, this is not what his generation does. And no, he had built 30 years of a career not being out at all. But he joined the Military Advisory Council, and then a couple years later, his partner, Alvin, passed away of liver failure. He was an Episcopal priest. Talk about another institution where you had to be a closeted gay man to be able to survive. And he came to me and said, "Dixon, I'm ready to come out. I'm going to tell our story." This says something about our strategy. I said, "No, sir. But you're grieving. You're not going to be able to respond to these questions right now. Take your time. There will be a moment." And the moment then was the 10th anniversary of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So this is 1993. And I had met two other flag officers at this point, both retired, a Rear Admiral who was a specialist in hypothermia, and another retired Brigadier General in the Army. And I went to each of them and asked them if they would come out in the New York Times, because I wanted to put a lie to the fact that LGBT people had not risen to the very highest ranks and had served with honor and distinction. And I went to Keith last, even though he's the first flag officer I'd met, a gay flag officer who I had met. I went to him last, and he was like, and he had this wonderfully gravelly voice, and he said, "Well, if you think it will help." I was like, "Oh, yes, sir, it will." So he came out, and it was a big splash in the New York Times. The next month, People magazine named them, the group, the three of them, as one of the most 100 influential Americans in 2003. So I always turn to Keith and says, "You are just 1/3 of an influential person, sir." So he was always, on the Hill with us from then on. And being able to have people like him and Rear Admiral Steinman and Brigadier General Richard, having them march with us on the Hill just was so incredibly important. One last story, which was, so part of our strategy, of course, was in 2000, we started thinking about taking it back to the Hill. And in 2005, we did the first introduction of the Military Readiness Enhancement Act. And I was up there with General Kerr and General Richard. And we were in one of the Senate buildings, and I saw Senator Hillary Clinton with a bevy of people around her. And I said, "Sirs, do you want to talk to her?" And they thought she was a rock star. I said, yeah, I don't know if I can do this. Let's see. And it's like right when I saw the people pivoted, when she was pivoting away, having ended the conversation, I belted out, "Senator Clinton, do you have time to meet two generals?" He turned right over, came right over to us. And if you're a good member of Congress, you know that generals and admirals are people that you really need to talk to and respect. And I turned to the "Sir, tell her why you're here." And they had their talking points down. And Hillary, or Senator Clinton's like, "Bill is so stupid. Let me know what I could do."
We would, again, like to invite anyone who may have served during Don't Ask, Don't Tell to share your own story with us. Is there anyone who would like to do that?
I would say the only thing I saw, I served fire attention with invitation of Don't Ask and also Missouri. I guess I was married to a woman during that time too, so I guess I was double positive. But I did work in military personnel, so I did see this sort of practices
come across my desk, and I did see the witch hunt. Where basically they would catch one way or another, one service member, and I believe got him to talk and to turn in his friends. That's an unfortunate thing.
Was this in Hawaii?
Prior to implementation.
Okay. Actually, I think I'd like to read an excerpt about a witch hunt that was, part Air Force, and I think this excerpt sort of tells a lot about what we faced and our strategy. And this is a witch hunt. It's a witch hunt that took place in Hawaii in 1997. The Hickam witch hunt started with Brian Harris, a senior airman who was facing court-martial for sodomy and sexual assault. The prosecutor promised in a pretrial agreement that the Air Force would reduce his sentence from life to 20 months if he gave the names of all the men with whom he had sex. He decided the only way to save his hide was to comply. So he provided 17 names, some incomplete. The Air Force, Army, Navy, and Marine Corps discharged the ones they could identify. I know of no other case in the military where prosecutors reduced the sentence of a heterosexual male service member accused of sexual assault if he gave the names of female service members with whom he had had consensual oral sex. It was a crime under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Nor do I know of any case where the military agreed to leniency in the case of a service member accused of adultery if he or she identified fellow officers or enlisted personnel who were engaged in extramarital affairs, also an offense at that time under the UCMJ. I flew to Honolulu, paid for out of my own pocket, as I often did because our budget was small, to meet with Captain Bob Saragosa. He is one of the 17 men named by Harris. Because he was an officer and Harris was an enlisted man, the Air Force was threatening Saragosa with court-martial for both sodomy and fraternization. I asked him to meet me under a large banyan tree at Hula's, a local gay bar. The bar has since moved, and alas, there's no banyan tree, but this was a come-to-Jesus meeting. Saragosa was stoic and reserved, or maybe he was just in shock and denial. His words were measured. He lowered his eyes as if looking inward, trying to decide on his next steps and the implication of any action he might take. I advised him that the Air Force planned to charge him criminally, that he needed to do everything he could to get them to back down. We had already lined up a pro bono criminal defense attorney in Honolulu because we were short-staffed and located 5,000 miles away. The JAG officer once called me and asked for the phone number of our local Honolulu office, and here I was. I told Saragosa he should go public. The people knew that the Air Force was conducting a witch hunt, something the Pentagon had promised would not happen. The service stood to receive significant bad press. And the one thing that the Pentagon hates more than losing a fight is bad press. I can't, he said, not out to my family. This was the bind that Don't Ask, Don't Tell placed many service members. The law was to get gays to shut up. The archaic view was that gay Americans would be so ashamed of themselves that they would not be open and honest about who they are. They would not even speak up to defend themselves, to demand equality, to cry injustice, to highlight hypocrisy. The closet is a powerful silencer, and Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a federally imposed closet. Bob, I said, there's a very real possibility that by the end of the week, you will be in jail. Do you want to call your mom now or when you're in jail? I never told somebody that they had to come out. I respect all of our journeys. I knew when I was 4 that I didn't come out until my early 20s. I was uneasy making him do something he didn't want to do. He clearly did not want to do that. He called the next day to report that he had spoken with his mother. I told her I was in trouble. He said, Honey, does this have to do with don't ask, don't tell? We both laughed. I said, moms always know. Now that Saragossa had come out to his family, he was willing to speak publicly. I usually wouldn't recommend from going from the closet to here I am overnight, but this was a legal necessity. Unfortunately, the mere threat of bad publicity convinced the Air Force at the 11th hour to back down from the court-martial. However, Saragossa was discharged under don't ask, don't tell into yet another career.
So the comment was made earlier that the day after repeal, the phones didn't ring off the hook. It was the big nothing burger, and it just kind of demonstrated that people hate not what they know, but what they fear. Certainly, looking back, we recognize there were no foregone conclusions at the beginning of this entire effort, and you had a very long, difficult, hard road to walk. So, my question is, did you ever lose hope?
Well, I titled the book Mission Possible because I always had hope. In fact, my husband's the one who provided the name Mission Possible, Jeremy, here on the first row. I actually never lost hope. It was a really hard battle, but every time we got a commander to back down and save somebody's career, and we did that quite often, I had hope. Every time public opinion started to tick up, I had hope. And ultimately, I told you 90% of service members were not comfortable with gays in 1993. When the Pentagon did their study in 2010, 70% said, no big deal. Look at that seismic shift in public opinion. So every time I saw an event that helped shift that public opinion, every time a member of Congress signed on to repeal, I had hope. And one of the things that I had hope on is that we were deliberately bipartisan in what we did. And we had Republican members supporting us at the very beginning because we did not make this a partisan issue. This was a national security issue. This is one where we thought everybody should agree. So that was our premise. And I had hope, even with, as an example, someone like Senator Lisa Murkowski. She ultimately stood with us in support of repeal in 2010. Nobody knew that she would be there, but I knew in 2005 because we had clients from Alaska who met with her and said, guys, I'm with you, but create the space where this can happen. I can't be out in front on this, but I'm there if you get us there. And so, when you have Admiral Mike Mullen and Secretary of Defense Gates and others all saying it's time for repeal, and then you had a Pentagon study that came down somewhat at the 11th hour, no, at the very end, but the Pentagon study came down and said, it's not going to be a wrenching issue. This is doable. That gave the cover for this to be a really huge bipartisan success.
I think what's remarkable, though, is kind of fast forward to where we are today. By way of example, a couple of years ago, Thanksgiving dinner, three of us there, and there on the beyond. Of course, was a part of that time. Sister-in-law, who was there, he had just retired being a captain in the Navy for 30 years. And then there was a third person there. He was an active duty naval, active duty Navy. Not only active, he was also performing the drag shows involved. And talking with him, he had no concept of all that. No concept. When you really think of that, and I'm sure it's subject to here and there, but he not only was he surviving, he also reenlisted. So he won a career When you really think about that, the military, in many ways, takes the leadership. Surgery of all institutions. I'm really trying to do
Yeah, so I'm just going to summarize in a line or two for the people who are listening on FaceTime that, there's an interesting juxtaposition of the histories of people who served, in a period when being gay was still listed as a psychiatric disorder, to the time when people were still facing witch hunts, both before and during domestic health, to somebody today that is, performing in drag shows and has a brilliant career path forward. It goes to one of the points that I made earlier to Andy's question about why did I write it. It's in part about teaching the history. And I actually would have an ask of you all, and maybe you have ideas as well on how to do this, but I would like to get this book, into, commander reading lists. I think this is a really important part of military history that they should endorse and ask their subordinates to consider reading. I would like to get this into the military-based libraries. I want kids to have access to this. They may not know about it. I really want to get this to as wide an audience because I think this history is incredibly important. And if we don't learn the history, if we don't learn the lessons from that history, then we can repeat the mistakes, and we don't want that.
Joe, did you have a comment?
Yes, I'd like to know a little bit about the risk of members of SLD and especially in uniform, actually there, and what protections you have.
Oh, the solemn promise that Michelle and I had was to try to do everything we could to protect service members who were facing harm, and I can't say that we, were successful at the beginning, because the harassment was really bad. People, would hear anti-gay epithets. They faced assaults. They, day in and day out, and we would do our best to try to make sure that those things then didn't turn into discharges as well. One of the things, we did these annual reports on Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This was how we built the sort of fact base of what was going on. These were the stories of our clients, and we analyzed them. And in our very first one, we warned the Pentagon, if you don't take harassment seriously, you're going to have another murder on your hands like Seaman Allen Schindler. And that sailor was brutally killed in Japan in 1992, which was part of why this issue is on the radar screen for people like Bill Clinton. And I wish we had not been true, but in 1999, Private First Class Barry Winchell was murdered by two soldiers at Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The Army, this is the Navy, tried to cover up what happened to Allen Schindler. The Army tried to cover up what happened to Barry Winchell. The difference was this time our organization was around, and we did an investigation on the ground while the Army was just saying it's a drunken brawl, tragic result, but we slowly pieced together what was happening. And this would not have happened but for SLDN, is that we got a copy of the initial criminal investigative report. And Michelle and I went to Quantico to meet with the head of the Criminal Investigative Division. And I said, sir, this isn't acceptable. And I said, did your investigators ask about motive? Did they ask, was he facing harassment before this? How often was he facing harassment? Did he report it to anybody? We're not interested in that. This is just a murder trial, and we're going to proceed that way. And I said, sir, the heart of a murder trial is motive here. My question's got a motive. And one thing that you learn in dealing with any part of the government is they're never going to say, yes, they will do what you ask. But in fact, in this case, they went back and interviewed soldiers 2 or 3 times and came up with a much fuller report of what happened. Bottom line, two soldiers were convicted for their role in the murder of Barry Winchell. But what was more important, and Joe, it goes to your bigger point, this was the first, I think, seismic event that changed how people started looking at Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because this was such a craven act of murder. Bill Clinton issued an executive order at our request dealing with hate crimes in the military, including sexual orientation. We got that hate crimes law 10 years before Congress acted at the national level. And the Pentagon took the issue of anti-gay harassment seriously. They came up with an action plan that adopted 7 of our recommendations, and it started getting trained from the service chiefs on down. So you had top-down leadership and commitment to try to stop, curb, mitigate the harassment. I knew, Michelle knew at the beginning, that if we did not change that culture of harassment, that culture of homophobia in the military, that even in 2009 with a president like Barack Obama, you would still not achieve repeal because the culture itself had not changed. So we did intervene, saved a lot of careers, prevented harassment. There's still a lot of harassment. Beginning in 2000, moving forward, those numbers started going down. The training started taking effect. And it meant by 2010, when service members were being interviewed, they said, yeah, it's no big deal to have openly gay people. Massive cultural shift.
There's a comment, not to be crass, but the comment was basically, who cares who you thought belongs to the sheep?
Is Barry Goldwater, Republican senator of Arizona, who said something to that effect. And it's like, you don't have to be straight to shoot straight.
So obviously you were very good president. And there's been major changes to benefit gay people over the past 10 years, gay marriage and so forth. How much do you think your success depends on that larger cultural shift, and how, or rather perhaps, do you think that larger cultural shift was significant because of your work?
The question for those listening in is, to what effect was the larger cultural shift in attitudes on LGBT Americans contributing to the ability to repeal Don't Act, Don't Tell, or to what extent was the efforts to repeal Don't Act, Don't Tell contributing to the larger cultural shift? And I think the answer is that there was a biofeedback loop. I think that they both helped. The fact that Service Members Legal Defense Network was out there, constantly presenting stories of individuals who are impacted by it, I think made a shift. To give you a classic example, in 2001, 2002, after 9/11, the military was discharging Arabic linguists for being gay. There was a critical shortage of people who could speak Arabic. And I think it was Barney Frank who said, this is just the height of stupidity, which it was, but that was an idea that really seeped into the culture about how dumb, the law itself was. There were a number of pieces, I do a chapter on this, of sort of cultural pieces on gays in the military that were really important. There was the film about Colonel Margaretta Kammermeyer, starring Glenn Close and Judy Davis, produced by Barbara Streisand. There was this brilliant World War II documentary called Coming Out Under Fire. The Barry Winchell murder, told through the eyes and heart of his lover, Calpurnia Adams, called Soldier Scroll, won all sorts of accolades. Shortly after that, Alan Schindler's mom had a film called Any Mother's Son. So, these were big sort of cultural moments. And then there were also ones that weren't specifically gays in the military, like Ellen DeGeneres coming out, like Will and Grace, like Queer Eyes of the Straight Guy. Those certainly played a role. And then you had ones that did both. You had The Real World did an entire story on, a civilian who was dating a guy that they kept his face covered up at RM Systems to try to save his career because he was serving on active duty. That let people know, just covering somebody's face up who's trying to have a relationship, just think what that's communicating to the general public. It's really profound. And then you had Ryken Poole, who was on Amazing Race 4 and won with his then partner. And they were identified as married, but marriage wasn't a thing at that moment. So just the don't ask, don't tell stories, I think, had a huge cultural impact. I think the larger culture also had a huge impact. I think that's part of why you saw such an amazing shift in public opinion. But I conclude with one other thing, that there were some legal decisions that were really important, like Lawrence versus Texas, that overturned the sodomy laws. But I think after Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed, you also had the transgender ban that was lifted. You had the sodomy law that was repealed in the military. And there's some who would argue that but for the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, you may not have had the Supreme Court side with us on marriage equality, because those were both such huge decisions that there needed to be some kind of political down payment, some kind of political will. I think you could argue it differently as well. But there's some who make that argument. And Michelle and I agreed, and Evan Wilson, who was one of the great leaders on marriage equality, we both believed back in '93 that these were the two issues that were sort of the cultural revolution that would make everything else possible.
That was, we were looking forward to acceptance of gay zoning allows corporate America to do the same thing.
Yes.
Basically, before that, most gays were viewed as sort of Christian, and to have military sitting up there and doing that. We were granted, it just made it easier for corporate America to decide the same thing. So I think what you're saying is right. We lost a lot of that swallow, like America as well as.
The point for the audience is corporate America followed the military.
Yeah.
And I think that's very true. The Pentagon was the largest employer, and if the Pentagon can do it, then everyone else can. That's Hobby Lobby.
Do you have any reason to believe there were any rumblings of reinstatement for the past administration?
What do you mean by reinstatement in the last administration? So the question is about reinstatement post Don't Ask, Don't Tell. There were some individuals who were able to reenlist. It popped up on my Facebook feed, an individual in Chicago who's a veteran, and in 2012, she joined the reenlistment ceremony for somebody who's been kicked out.
No, actually, my question was during the prior administration. Do you have any reason to believe there was any fault?
Yeah. So the question is, under the Trump administration, they did change the ban on transgender Americans, but no, they didn't go after Don't Ask, Don't Tell or lesbian, gay, bisexual service members. And I think part of this is, Don't Ask, Don't Tell was repealed in 2011. It had 7 years of acculturation, and the Pentagon did a phenomenal job of really trying to anticipate all the issues that could come up, and they trained 1.8 million service members on what the new law would be, and there was broad support for the change. So I think that there was a deep acculturation that allowed the transition to allow lesbian, gay, bisexual service members to take hold. The lifting of the transgender ban, which was by regulation, was done at the end of 2014. And pretty quickly thereafter, even had a new administration coming in. I don't think that it had the sort of deep acculturation that was needed. My hope is, now that Biden has reinstated open service for transgender Americans, with that kind of acculturation is going to take hold over the next 4 or more years.
David?
One question. I'm just curious, when we're talking about how change happens and who the players are, did you have contact or conversations, you know, behind the scenes with like Get Equal and Dan Choi and the protests that they did? But how did that all, I mean, what did you guys share? How did that all play out?
Yeah, good question. So I left Service Members Legal Defense Network in 2007. And Dan Choi, for people who don't know, so the question was, what kind of conversations, interactions were there between Service Members Legal Defense Network and other groups that were working on this? And was mentioned Dan Choi, who was a West Point graduate, and Eric Linguist, who was really one of the most dynamic and articulate individuals. He was on Rachel Maddow almost every other day. Not that much, but he really was an incredible dynamic spokesperson. And Get Equal was formed, you know, in 2010. And one of the things that they did were they were a little bit more act up. They were more direct action. They were chaining themselves to the fence of the White House. So you had groups like that. Then you had groups like the Center for American Progress, who always works at this very meta level. You know, as Winnie Stackelberg at the Center for American Progress, who convinced the members of Congress that they needed to change a piece of the law because the Pentagon was opposing Congress voting on repeal until they did their study. But members of Congress knew if they didn't go on and vote on it, it was going to be too late. And so she came up with the idea of a sort of delayed repeal through certification so that they could try to get the repeal done. The reality is, the repeal took place in the Senate December 18, 2010. This is a lame duck session. It's a lame duck session after the Democrats got walloped and the Republicans were going to take control of the House. And you know, despite our great bipartisan efforts, it was also clear that had that law not been repealed then, it would still be the law today. So all the groups were meeting and talking with each other. They were also all doing sort of their own thing and their own take. You know, my view, and this is something about social change, I think it also applies to corporate America, you're always working in an ecosystem. And that ecosystem doesn't mean that things are always in direct alignment. You're all not doing all the same things, but you're hoping the ecosystem is actually ultimately producing the result that's needed. And ultimately, that is what came together.
Any other questions or stories to share? We are coming close to the end of our evening together. Dixon, I was wondering if you might have any final thoughts or reflections to share with us.
Buy the book. So Browserbot does have a couple of copies left. Ask them to buy more to support the independent bookstores. David, I think, has a couple of copies here if you want to buy here. I have a couple of copies as well. I'd really appreciate it if you would, if you like it, do a review on Amazon. Look at Gary's. He did a review. The Amazon algorithms is like they don't like promote your book until you hit 50. So we're at 23 as of this evening. So I really welcome your support there. If you have ideas on how to get this book out further into a broader and broader audience, I'm always eager to hear those ideas. I think it's a book that deserves to be read. I'm planning myself to send copies to the libraries of Bill Clinton and Obama when his library is done. My friends at the Modern Military Association of America are going to work to try to get these into base libraries, but they can't do it alone. So people who want to support that effort would be really terrific. I mean, I think, Gary, that what this goes to ultimately is about hope. It's about being able to overcome. It's being able to triumph. It's being able to be ourselves and to be authentic. And I'll just recount this story. If I don't cry in telling it, Jeremy and I went to the retirement ceremony of a good friend of ours, Commander Zach Matthews in the U.S. Coast Guard, just 3 weeks ago now. And the first thing that was remarkable about it was at the hangar at DCA, and Zach announced that he thought these affairs were very stodgy. And so he invited Miss Richfield to come, and and she is a local Rehoboth resident now. And she was just great. She had a perfect sequin, red, white, and blue flag dress. And it was fun watching the reaction. The reaction was one of enthusiasm and endorsement. It wasn't none of this sort of shrinking back in the seat. So that was really lovely. But then what was even more profound is when the captain stood up to thank Zach for his service, he said, "Zach, you had to serve under this law for 10 years under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. On behalf of the Coast Guard, I apologize." That to me is pretty remarkable. And it shows how far we've come.
Dixon, thank you for sharing your evening with us. Thank you for writing this very important book and capturing this history. Thank you for achieving justice and equality and for making history happen.
Thank you, Gary. Hold on. And I'm happy to sign books if people have their books here.